Everyone, my name is Edward Tse. I'm with Gao Feng Advisory Company. We are a strategy and management consulting firms with roots in China. I'm very happy today, in fact, extremely delighted to have one of my old clients and a great friend, Adi Segal, to be with us today. I've known Adi for well over 12 years, I guess, more than 12 years, something like that. We get to know each other when Adi and his company hired us to do some work at that time. But we stay in touch all along, and we have kept in close contact and have a lot of conversations on how global multinational companies, or what we usually call MNCs, can be successful in China. So today, I'd like to have a dialogue with Adi and sort of, seek his wisdom on how global companies can be successful in China and what is his general reflections about doing business in general. Because Adi is a very established business person. And let me just introduce him briefly before we go into the questions. Adi Segal is a retired president from Reckitt, a FTSE 20 company, which is a global leader in nutrition, hygiene, and health. He has been with Reckitt for 27 years before he retired. And I believe his last job was the leader of the global nutrition and health business. Also, very importantly, and that's where we met, was that he spent 7 years leading Reckitt's business in China and also North Asia. And that was, to him, was a transformational experience. So today, I'm very glad to have Adi. And I thank you, Adi, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shea, for having me. And also thank you very much for your contribution to those 7 years and to the learnings that we are about to discuss.
Fantastic. I've known you since, as I mentioned, well over 12 years ago, and since we worked together. And as you also know, I work with a large number of global multinational companies, MNCs, in China and also outside of China. I say you come to me as a very unique person. It's because not only you were very smart in running business, I also find you to have a lot of wisdom when it comes to knowing and talking about issues related to China and how China relates to the rest of the world. Because your company, Reckitt, was a global company. I still remember when we started working together, your CEO at that time, Rakesh Kapoor, also a good friend, a mutual good friend of us. He told us that at that time, Reckitt's business in China was something like number 25th ranked big market in the world for Reckitt, or something like that. And I also remember, perhaps 1 year before you retired, or maybe a couple of years before you retired from Reckitt, Rakesh was so glad to tell me that China's business for Reckitt has gone up to number 2 in the world's ranking. I think right behind Europe, wasn't it?
It was right behind the US, actually.
Right behind the US, right? And that was an incredible development within, let's say, a decade's time, that a market like China sort of had gone up so rapidly in its importance to a major global company. And I also remember you and Rakesh at that time actually talk about the vision of creating China as well as India to be very important markets for Reckitt on a global basis. And you made it. You created that from a vision to reality. And that's really incredible. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the whole story of how you and Rakesh sort of thought about this, committed to it, and making it happen.
So actually, for many years, the company Reckitt Benckiser had struggled to grow in China. And what we were trying to do for many, many years was to actually take our global operating model and apply that in China. Also pick up the same framework of operation and apply it in China. And that was not working because we found that we were in categories which were about household cleaning, trying to charge very premium products and make high margins, and then, somehow put that money back into advertising and grow the market. This was quite difficult in China because just for the simple reason that it's very difficult to compete with Chinese companies on costs on things like cleaning products and expect to really win that kind of battle. And at the same time, the Chinese ecosystem was different. So it had different opportunities and different threats. And it was only when we really went through many years of challenge and difficulty, and we thought that there was nothing else left to lose because we hadn't really got too much, that we really thought of a different way of how to address China. And what we said was that the first point was that China is so important and yet so small for us that there is no choice. We cannot claim to be a global MNC unless we are big in China. There's a massive opportunity in China. So the growth opportunity for us in China itself was significant enough to have a material impact on the global group. So very early on in the process, even when we were less than 0.5% of global revenue, the Chinese management team got together and said, look, we are going to sound completely crazy, but we are going to put a crazy vision out there saying that by 2020, we expect to deliver 20% of the global growth of the company. Now, this was completely unheard of at that point of time, but we actually made that commitment. What we also did was we knew that we could not do this without help. So Rakesh and I, we asked the global leadership team to come to China to immerse themselves and to spend time educating themselves about China. And you also would remember this because you spoke with that team at that time. When the team came to China, they saw the opportunity, they saw the growth, and we had discussions on two things. First, because China was so important, we needed a different strategy. We needed a bespoke strategy. Normally, this was not something that was easy to agree for a company that could be quite centrally driven from a strategic point. But we agreed that our China strategy would be focused on growing on health and hygiene rather than growing home care, right? And that was a big deal because that immediately got us into high gross margin categories. And that got us into categories where Chinese consumers are prepared to pay premiums. So as we learned later, Chinese people like to pay premiums in categories which give them health or which give them face, not just utilitarian categories, right? So this was one important learning that we had. The second thing we said was that rather than trying to impose an external framework on China which doesn't work, we should grow with China and we should actually use the best of China to influence us. So way back in 2010, 2011, we started working on e-commerce. We started working on social media in 2009, 2010, even before WeChat was launched. With Weibo itself, we shifted all our spends there. And at that point of time, we started by making small impacts. But over a period of time, these small impacts in both revenue as well as in, I would say, the models progressed to the extent that today, that business is probably almost like, let's call it close to $1 billion business, which has a significant proportion, let's say 70% driven by e-commerce. But not just that, the learnings that we got from that e-commerce growth and that journey that we had actually then informed how we set up e-commerce in the rest of the world, and then had a very material impact for the company subsequently. And I would say the third thing we did differently in China is we opened ourselves to a more Chinese ideal of a Chinese way of growing, which is rather than anything else, how can we find people, partner with them, and actually build enduring, lasting partnerships which actually deliver value and growth, and eventually make both partners almost like family. You may have issues sometimes, it doesn't matter, but at least you can talk about them, you can address them, and as long as you have a common view of a shared future, you can work through partnership. So China taught us, in a sense, partnership. China taught us how to look at the world of high technology. China taught us how to think big in the long term, but also do it in a way where we are not overestimating China in the short term, but not underestimating China in the long term. So when you put all of these learnings together, along with the fantastic teams and the quality of people that we always had in China, this resulted over a period of time in explosive growth, where China became our #1 growth driver as a company for many, many, many years from there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic story. I remember all the elements that you talk about, and we can go through each of these elements in a little bit more details, right? But I remember the vision that you and Rakesh set out, and at that time it was almost impossible. But you made it. You made it because you had a vision, and you have a courage and the understanding to take on a very different approach than what you've been doing in Reckitt in the other parts of the world. So that was a very good and important part of why you're successful. You mentioned the e-commerce. I also remember that very vividly, because I think you were probably one of the earliest pioneers, at least within the MNCs, in really taking on e-commerce or digital as a way to go to the market in China. And in fact, at that time, I remember quite a number of my other clients have heard about your successful story and asked us to really, could we help to benchmark, right? What Reckitt had been doing in China. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that, because I know that you set up eRB, right? Which is the global e-commerce platform for RB as a whole. So if you don't mind, if you can talk a little bit about it, because that notion, by now, of course, a lot of people know about it. But 7, 8 years ago, it wasn't really that well known, in particular in the Western world, right? So how did you come up with that? And what did you do to really get it started and get it on traction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things I always say about China, and one of the reasons I always want to be connected with China, is that I think China gives people in the West, like people like me who are now in the UK, a superpower. And the superpower that China gives me is the ability to see the future. So certainly in the world of e-commerce, certainly in the world of tech, along with the US, I would say Silicon Valley perhaps, China is the one place where if you see what's happening in the world of e-commerce, data, AI today, this is what is going to happen in the rest of the world 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. And if you can see a particular future coming at you like a train, you can prepare for it much better. But you can also see how those problems were addressed in China, how those problems were solved in China, and then you can take those same solutions global, and those solutions work, in my experience. So let me explain what I mean. So the first thing we learned in China about e-commerce is that e-commerce is a multi-channel business. It's not a monolithic business. And each channel incrementally creates your business. Now, each of these channels requires a completely different strategy. So when we were in China, we found that there were 3 kinds of e-commerce businesses for us as a company. The first was an e-commerce business where we knew how to do the business. This is like selling to Alibaba marketplace vendors, or setting up an online store on Alibaba. Where we know how to do something, the primary objective of us as a company becomes to try and scale that. Normally, the best way to scale things, go back to the old assembly line idea of the Model T of Henry Ford. Basically, you try and divisionalize labor. You make people repeat the same thing multiple times, and you can put a lot of money, a lot of scale, and a lot of energy into creating an organization or a machine. And each part of the machine has a very well-defined purpose and repeats that with greater and greater efficiency. So parts of e-commerce that you know how to do, you will go after, you will staff them, you will resource them, and you will expect high revenues, certainly, and your objective is scale. Then there's a second kind of e-commerce business, which is all these new business models that keep getting generated. So for example, how do you do e-commerce on TikTok? How do you do e-commerce for gaming? What is the role of NFTs in e-commerce, for example? How do you do cross-border e-commerce? If there's a Chinese diaspora in the US, how can you leverage them to drive sales in China? You don't know how to do these things. So what you do here is, rather than putting a lot of money at the problem, and rather at aiming at scale, you actually create an organization which is very nimble, almost like a startup within your company. And you are focused on giving autonomy to the startup so that they can make the decisions that they need to without any friction. The reason you don't want friction is because you want the flywheel. The flywheel is try, learn, change, try, learn, change, try, learn, change. You want the flywheel to turn very fast. Every time the flywheel turns, you have one learning. In normal organizations like large MNCs, you have one learning a quarter. But in this case, you need to have one learning every 15 minutes. The more the learnings you have, the faster the flywheel turns, then the faster that business grows to a point where you know how to run the business, at which point you can transfer it to the first kind of model, which is what I call the B big model. So there is a B big model and there's a B fast model. Then there is a third model, which is a super important model. This is what I call the Be Bold model. And this also we learned in China. So what you do here is you reimagine your company as a platform. Your company has a significant amount of capabilities, services, regulatory reach. How can you connect with other people in the ecosystem, welcome them in your platform, form a win-win partnership? Win-win does not mean I win first. Win-win in China means you win first. If you can set up these kind of partnerships, you will find a lot of people who have what I call the Chinese dream. The Chinese dream is very similar to what the American dream used to be a couple of 100 years ago. Chinese people have realized that it's, as Mr. Deng Xiaoping said, it's to be rich is glorious. So you have all of these highly driven, highly capable people whom your platform is enabling to be rich. As they become rich, you tie yourself to them structurally so that you also get dragged along with them and you get learnings in that ecosystem. So you therefore have an ecosystem play, which eventually becomes something like an incubator, an accelerator. It becomes an investment platform into other companies, partnerships, relationships. So these are three different kind of archetypes and different kind of teams that need to run this. So when we built ERB globally, we actually took these three archetypes and we established them across the world. And we actually built organizations that worked on each of these three verticals with different business models, along with two other principles. The first is no country is an exception. So in China, e-commerce went everywhere. So across the world, we had a principle that said, whether you're in Chile or whether you're in the US or whether you're in Indonesia, I still expect e-commerce to be a #1 driver of growth. No country is an exception. It's not sequential, it's parallel. And the second, no category or brand is an exception. So just because you're sitting on a category that is about hand wash, for example, rather than a category that's baby formula, it's no excuse to say that your e-commerce contribution is low. It's just that you haven't found the right business model yet. So change your business model. So those are all the learnings that came out of China, along with, of course, the highly executional learnings of how to do e-commerce, how to set up a store, how to optimize, how to do a TikTok store. All those also came out of China. So for us, I think there's a huge debt of gratitude to our Chinese teams and our Chinese partner on how this was created and how these learnings then later subsequently impacted the whole world for the company.
That's a really fantastic story, because you started with a vision, and you knew digital or e-commerce is coming. Perhaps not many other people outside of China really realized that, certainly within RB at that time, and perhaps in other global companies as well. But you took the vision and you turn it into practice. And looks like you also very quickly come to realization that there are three types of business model, three archetypes. And then that vision was really very helpful in my view, right? Because it really applies to different parts of the world as you try to roll this out. And not everybody have to follow one archetype. Every market may be different, but the notion that you need to move in that direction was already pretty clear in your mind, very early days, right? But today, of course, a lot of people know about it, but this is like 7-8 years later, right? But 7-8 years earlier, you had the vision, and that was really amazing in my view, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been such a fulfilling journey, but in hindsight, the journey was made relatively easy because we went on a journey. It was almost like a scout mission in China, which actually taught us what to do. And then the main army could follow later. And that resulted in China then delivering growth twice, because the first time it delivered growth, it was direct growth coming from China, which we actually did achieve the 20% of growth by 2020, actually by 2019. But the second element of growth that came from China was the massive explosion of e-commerce growth that followed. That also came partially because of the competitive advantage we gained globally by using all these different archetypes. So we were running on 3 cylinders or 2 cylinders, while many other companies were running on 1 cylinder, which is just working with Amazon or just doing a part of the e-commerce ecosystem.
When you talk about the archetypes in the e-commerce, within the e-commerce context, you mentioned about the model to work with the partners. I know that working with partners as a philosophy in China for RB or for Reckitt wasn't just only about e-commerce. It was in general, a general business philosophy for you. And I believe that you were a key driver behind doing this. Because I still remember, when we worked together, you said, well, this is not how we work from the mother company, right? That's not how we work. But in China, this is how we should work. And you actually, from that, you synthesize a number of learning from working with the partners, with the Chinese teams and so on. Perhaps you can also articulate on that from your standpoint.
Sure. So actually, interestingly, at one point as a management team, we also went away and we spent some time on the Great Wall, and I have some nice pictures and memories from that, where we said,
I was there.
yeah, of course. Where we worked on our philosophy for China, right? And one of the interesting things, I mean, there was 9 or 10 things in the philosophy of China, but one of the parts of the philosophy was we created a Venn diagram. The Venn diagram said, this is how we work globally. This is how we work, what works in China. We want to be the intersection of those two. But if there is a conflict, then we will prefer the one that works in China. So, so we found a way to bring a global culture. And in the rare occasion there was conflict, we optimized for the local, right? So in this case, look, we were so lucky that we found Chinese partners that we worked with who are so capable, so principled, so structured, so focused on growing the business, so selfless in a sense, that it really taught us as a global multinational what partnership could be and what partnership should be. Interestingly, we used to have 4 global values: achievement, commitment, entrepreneurship, and teamwork. After spending some time in China with the leadership team, over a period of time, the 4th value changed from teamwork to partnership in the Reckitt of that time. That really was a gift that came from, in my opinion, our Chinese partner, who is very much is led by a remarkable person who is himself almost like a sage, who really is very young, but very dynamic, very focused on the business, but very focused on the key principles. As long as the principles are right, everything else follows. So let's focus on making the principles right. And then, of course, execution will happen, right? So, and we learned that, one of the biggest lessons that this partner gave me was, we were once having a conversation about partnership. And he asked me, so what is partnership to you? So I said, partnership is win-win. Yes. He says, no, that's not possible. It's not possible to have win-win, because you cannot be in a situation where you win and everyone wins and everyone keeps winning all the time. It doesn't work like that. So I said, what's your definition of partnership? He said, my definition of partnership is you win first. I let you win first. Once you have won, you pull me up so I can win as well.
Yeah.
And if both partners are working on the belief that you win first, and bring that element of selflessness and that demonstrated care for growing the partner's business in a principle-centered leadership way, in a way that understands that legal contracts in China, one of the things about the Chinese culture that I learned is, in the West, we spend a lot of time doing a legal contract. And when the legal contract and the negotiation is done, the person from the West is saying, now that is done. Now we are going to start working together. But the Chinese person is thinking, okay, I've signed this worthless piece of paper with you. I've spent enough time with you now to know that I trust you. Now that I trust you, let's have the real discussion on the table, right? So the moment you know that, and you know that the principle, your partner is very principled, but it's just that perhaps the partner sometimes plays with different rules. So you better go and understand what those rules are. Yes. It can create a very long and very harmonious relationship. And in this case, that has actually been the case. So I would say our success in China, I would entirely attribute to our fantastic people and the teams in China and the fantastic partnerships that we had in China.
I know your local partner is Manon.
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember talking to him about this as well. And he used the Chinese term, right? He called it 利他主义, 利他. So I guess in English, roughly we can say this is providing benefits to others first. So yes. Benefits to others first. Would you agree with that? Is that how you interpret it?
Absolutely right. And the beautiful thing about a partnership is if both partners are trying to do that, it is so visible, right?
Right.
And
it's also enjoyable, isn't it?
It's enjoyable, right? I mean, I remember for every other country, when you do a business review, do a meeting, you do that in a very formal setting. what we realized was the best way to work with our partners in China was, rather than spending time in meeting rooms, you actually go with the GM of the partner, which is Merlin, and go to a particular town, work all day with the teams there, and any issues or any strategy that has to be discussed can be discussed verbally. You don't really need PowerPoint charts or large strategic presentations to bring that. You can actually talk about it like friends, right?
Yeah.
And by the end of it, you find that you have contributed together towards solving the problem. And you also understand what is important to your counterparty. It may not be so important to you. You may not understand what is important because you don't have the cultural nuance of what is really the important piece. But it's only by spending time, by using the 2 ears and 1 mouth in that ratio, that you actually start to understand what is really important. And once you understand what is important, then you can actually help your partner progress in areas that they consider important rather than what you consider important.
Fantastic. So Adi, I think you had also very unique experience, the fact that you spent 7 years in China and North Asia, right? At the same time, you also spent a lot of time back in the headquarters. In fact, you became the president in the headquarters, for one of the biggest business from the headquarters. So you have looked into China both from the standpoint of being in China, but also you look into China from the standpoint of from headquarters to China, right? So you have two different perspectives. And what would be your advice to general multinational companies when it comes to sort of how to look at China from both dimensions?
So from the headquarters perspective, I think it's the first thing to be aware of is how important China is.
Yeah.
And the potential of step-changing growth in China, to not only what that does to your growth numbers as a company, but also what that does to you as a company from a innovation capability point of view, because you can take your Chinese innovation out. What it does to you in terms of a culture point of view, because being inclusive and being able to work in China actually for many companies can be challenging. And if you can do that, that actually gives you great learning on how to work in other parts of the world as well. Certainly, Eastern cultures are very much like China in a sense. So it's really, really important to grow in China. You need to have the right expectation for China. So over the long term, you want to expect that China is your number 1 or at most number 2 growth driver. And even if it is the number 25th country in size. And if that is not happening over a decade, then you're making a mistake somewhere. The third thing I would say is we tend to overestimate China in the short term and underestimate China in the long term. So very often from headquarters, we are not achieving our targets every year in China, but because of that, we keep changing direction. And that prevents us from compounding on this S curve that would absolutely blow our targets out of the water 5-6 years from now, as long as we deliver stability in China. Stability in China is very important. Stability in management outlook, stability, being reasonable, being not flapping around too much, right? Not doing the yo-yo, not changing your management teams 25 times. It's very important to give your Chinese team that reassurance and that stability. And that only happens when you can have the right leaders and the right partners in China. China is a country where leadership is super important. Your Chinese team will look to your leaders almost like the head of the family. Right? And while there may be disputes and positives and negatives, nobody doubts that the head of the family has the interests of the family in mind. That's also in a sense how Chinese people look at the Chinese government. So so there's a huge amount of trust there. So you better have somebody there who can function in that role as head of the family. People in China follow leaders. They don't necessarily follow the strategy. The leader is the embodiment of the strategy. So in China, you want to have somebody who is a virtuous leader, who can build followership, who can build a 5-year or a 10-year consistent traction. And you want a virtuous leader who is curious, who has a little bit of time to look at all the innovation that's happening in China and spend time and effort thinking about how that can be brought in to transform the growth engine of the company. If you can do that, you can have a virtuous leader, you can be outward looking in China and experiment all the time, and you can manage your own expectations as a company in the short term and don't limit your expectations in the long term. and be aware that you will have to have a different strategy and a different operating model for China, then there is a very good chance to succeed in China.
But a lot of the MNC executives in China tells me, China's culture and societal aspects are so different than mine or ours. How can I navigate, in this complicated and ambiguous culture, societal values, from our standpoint? What would be your advice to these people?
Well, I think every place, every game has rules. And you need to understand the rules of the game as you start playing it. There is no point starting to, play football with the cricket team and expect them to play by the, football rules when all they know is the cricket rules. So when you are in China, people spend a lot of time learning the Chinese language, and I think that's very good. But I think it's very important. It's more important to learn how Chinese people think than what Chinese people say. You can always find someone to translate for you. But the thinking is the most important thing. And China is this deep civilization that goes back 5,000 years or 3,000 years or whatever it is. And 3,000 years of civilization grooves certain patterns of thinking and working and doing, which are actually much older and deeper than what you have in the West, but you don't see it because it's all submerged beyond the surface. And Chinese can be very respectful and therefore not very demonstrative, and they will not tell you to your face what the issue is. So in China, you have to listen for the silences. You have to listen to the silences. If you're making a mistake, your team will tell you by their silence. They will tell you that if you are in tune with your team, you will always know when you are making a mistake in China, because they will find a way to communicate to you. You just need to be listening. So in China, you have to listen all the time. You have to keep building your database of what are the societal norms. Like I said before, just take an example about negotiation. So as a Westerner going into China, you are expecting that after a hard negotiation, now the deal is signed, now you're going to harmoniously work together and everything is cool. But the Chinese partner is thinking that now that this person has proven some level of trust, now I'll bring the real requirements out, and then now we are really going to start discussing things, right? Now, the Western person may think this is not ethical. The Chinese person may think this Westerner is very naive. But both of them are conditioned and programmed by their history and by their upbringing. So having the empathy to try and submerge yourself into this environment and understand why, first of all, assume good intent, and then understand why that person did what they did, and spend that time doing that and build that into your mental model of China. And then your mental model will keep improving, and you will be able to do business in China, because in reality, Chinese people are very trustworthy. They're very honest. They're very clear. They're telling you clearly, but you are not listening.
I think, Ali, you're very unique in a way, right? Because you work in a global multinational company. You are one of the most senior person in the whole entire company on a global basis. You have the roots in India. You came from India. You worked for quite a long time in China. What is the fact that your Indian roots and the fact that you were in China? How did it help? How did that help you to really better appreciate China? Perhaps because of some similarities between the Indian culture and the Chinese culture. How did it help you to understand China? And what advice would you give? I think
there are very deep
managers, right? From that internalization.
Yeah, I think there are very deep similarities between India and China, just philosophically. And if you go back far enough in history, then you see that a lot of this comes from the root of Buddhism and Hinduism, that eventually some bit of it turned into Buddhism, some of it moved to China, then it evolved further in China, it moved to other places. But for thousands of years, people have just have thought in certain patterns, and those patterns are relatively similar between India and China. Just a second.
No problem.
So those patterns are quite similar between India and China, and this societal programming and conditioning, actually, for me as an Indian, I felt very much at home in China. Right? China is also a warm culture. It's a culture where people are looking to help you. It's very much like India from that perspective. And being able to create a network of trust in China, like a network of trust you have in India, I think it's really good. Chinese people have the same kind of inventiveness that Indian people do, in a sense. They always try and find a solution to a problem. It may not be the traditional solution, and they'll always find a way to do it more efficiently, cheaper, save some money on the side. So there are so many similarities. And if you're actually looking for the similarities more than the differences, then you find them. But if you look for the differences, you find those too.
Fantastic. Perhaps the last question, Adi. You were in China for 7 years, but you have also been away from China for 7 years. 7 years is a lot. Well, it's short, but it's also long, right? And in this 7 years time since you've been away from China, what changes have you seen about China? Does it change the way that you think about China? Does it change the way that you would recommend to global companies when it comes to China?
Well, a lot has changed in these 7 years. And actually what's happened in a sense is the unraveling of globalization to some degree. So, and the world is becoming more bipolar again. I think America and a lot of people in the West have finally realized the level of development and advancement of China, not just as a manufacturing economy, but as a true innovation of engine of innovation. And that actually points at, along with let's call it the mathematics of the money, that points to the potential of a changing world order. And whether that's potential or inevitability is something that, of course, there may be different views about. But this has resulted in more protectionism. Also, globalization has been hit quite hard because of COVID, because global supply chains have contracted, and now people have realized that actually you need to have local supply chains. Globalization has also been hit, in my opinion, by global warming and the need for global supply chains to become more local in future also. And that means that, in a sense, China as a manufacturing hub for global companies is perhaps getting a bit more difficult and also more expensive. So I think companies are pivoting. So in the past, China has had a massive role in the supply chain, along with, of course, the growth that you have in China. And for some companies who have been smart, a role in innovation. So the role in supply chain, I think, over a period of time is perhaps coming down or getting disrupted at least. And also it's been difficult to travel into China for the last couple of years with COVID, with the different ways that countries have with managing COVID, where the West is now broadly open. The UK has now even removed testing on people who are coming in because they think they're done with the virus. Whereas in China, it is still very, very protected. So this has resulted in ties being stretched and cut off. But I do think that at its heart, the two ends of the civilization, they're a bit like yin and yang. They can't really do without each other. That's the whole point about yin and yang, right? If there is a yin, there will be a yang. So there needs to be two poles in the world. And ideally, these two need to operate in harmony, in consonance, so that the black and white, when you spin it together, becomes beautiful white, right? And it becomes one color. And if that happens, you could have a fantastic new global order, which is really built on growth, on cooperation, on the best of both, in a sense. But it's becoming a bit more difficult to see that with the way things are going and as positions harden on both sides. But companies can always, decide this for themselves and make the right investments to really get the right benefits, but also to contribute back to China, which I think is so important.
Well, thank you, Ali. It's been wonderful. Every time I talk to you, I pick up a lot that I learned along the way. Similarly, this time as well. So, really thank you for your time. Before we go, just one last question. I knew that you retired from Reckitt, but I noticed that you are not leaving China. You're still doing work related to China. Perhaps you can give us the last your comments about your latest developments with respect to your endeavors about China.
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, being connected to China and being able to understand a bit of what's happening in China is a superpower. And I don't want to give up that superpower. So, and I'm also deeply connected to China. And I do I think it's very important for anybody who tracks innovation globally to track what's happening in China. So I've taken up a role as a non-executive director on a company called JP Morgan China Growth and Income. It's a FTSE listed company that actually has a mandate to invest in China. And I hope to be able to contribute some of my learnings and insights about China on that board. But also at the same time, I hope to learn in a very consolidated fashion what's happening in China and be in touch with China, which is so important to me.
Great. Well, that's great news. I look forward to staying in touch with you and continue to have a dialogue and continue to track your progress. I know that you will continue to do really well for yourself and also between Europe, China, and the rest of the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you, Adi.